Get 144 frames per second in Forza Horizon 6 on RTX 4060. Tested settings for 1080 p 1440p. DLSS presets, ray tracing comparisons, and zero-stutter configs. The RTX 4060 carries 8GB VRAM and 3272 CUDA cores, solid for 1080p, stretched at 1440p. Forza Horizon 6 defaults to Ultra, with ray-traced reflections and shadows enabled. At 1080p native, that config delivers 78 frames per second average, 61 frames per second, 1% low during dense festival scenes. At 1440p native, you drop to 52 frames per second average. The VRAM ceiling matters here. Ultra textures consume 7.2 gigabytes in our testing, leaving minimal headroom for dynamic assets. When the game loads a new festival zone or spawns 20 AI racers, frame time spikes hit 28 milliseconds, perceived as visible stutter even if average frames per second stays above 60. Yields the in-game VRAM counter. Target: 144 frames per second average, 120 frames per second, 1% low. This config prioritizes motion clarity and input response over screenshot-worthy reflections. Resolution 1920x1080, DLSS. Quality: renders at 1280x720, upscales to 1080p. Ray tracing off. Texture: quality high. 5.8 gigabytes. VRAM usage. Environment texture quality, high. Shadow quality, medium. Reflection quality, medium. MSI, off. DLSS handles anti-aliasing. Ambient occlusion, SSAO. Motion blur, off. Subjective. Enable if you prefer cinematic feel. Depth of field, off. World car level of detail, high. Anisotropic filtering, stints. This setup delivers 148 frames per second average in open road racing, 132 frames per second during festival crowds. The 1% lows sit at 118 frames per second, no perceptible stutter. DLSS quality mode is. The 4060 can handle 1440p if you lean on DLSS balanced and accept that ray tracing stays off. Native 1440p at high settings produces 68 frames per second. Playable, but not smooth enough for competitive Horizon races. Use the same settings list from the 1080p section with two changes. Set DLSS to balanced. Renders at 1130x636, upscales to 1440p. And drop shadow quality to low. This yields 112 frames per second average, 96 frames per second, 1% low. Shadows at low still render sharp contact shadows under cars. The difference from medium is distant tree shadow resolution you won't notice at 80 mph. VRAM usage climbs to 7.4 gigabytes at 1440p with high textures. Forza Horizon 6 implements RT reflections on car paint and RT shadows for environmental objects. With ray tracing enabled at 1080p DLSS quality, the RTX 4060 drops from 148 frames per second to 86 frames per second. That's a 62 frames per second penalty for reflections you only notice when photo mode is active or you're stopped at a festival. During actual racing, RT reflections update at half rate to save performance. They lag behind your steering inputs by 1 frame, creating a disconnect between what the car is doing and what the paint shows. Screen space reflections at medium quality look 85% as good during motion and cost 0 frames. If you capture in-game photos, 3 settings consume disproportionate testing time but deliver negligible results on this GPU tier. World car level of detail controls how many polygons distant AI vehicles use. Ultra versus high is a 3 frames per second difference, imperceptible. High is the ceiling. Environment geometry quality affects rock formations and building detail at distance. The 4060 handles Ultra here with a 2 frames per second penalty versus medium, but the visual gain only shows in replays or drone camera mode. During racing, your eyes track the road 50 meters ahead. Background geometry complexity is invisible. Stick with high to bank those 2 frames per second for more important settings. Deformable terrain adds tire ruts in. Settings alone don't guarantee 144 frames per second. 3 system-level optimizations matter as much as in-game configs. First, verify you're running NVIDIA driver 566.14 or newer. The 565.XX branch has a known frame pacing bug in Forza Horizon 6 that causes 8 to 12 millisecond stutter spikes even at high average frames per second. GeForce Experience will auto-update if you enable driver notifications. Enable resizable bar in BIOS and NVIDIA control panel. FH6 sees a 7-9% frames per second lift with RBR active on RTX 4060. Set Windows power plan to high performance. Balanced mode throttles GP. You boost clocks during loading screens, and those clocks don't recover fast enough when racing resumes. Disable Xbox Game Bar and Game Mode. DLSS quality renders at 66.6% native resolution and upscales. Performance mode renders at 50% and upscales. At 1080p quality mode, looks identical to native during motion. Performance mode, 540p internal, introduces slight shimmering on distant power lines and fence posts. Noticeable if you're looking for it, invisible during competitive racing. Performance mode gains you 28 frames per second over quality at 1080p. Use it if you're struggling to hit 154 frames per second with the optimized settings above, or if you play on a 240 Hz monitor and want to push past 200 frames per second. The image quality trade is minor compared to the input latency improvement from higher frame rates. At 1440p, build your free playbook for any GPU at betterfps.com/optimize.